I never thought that buying our first house together at 73 would lead me down a path that would shake everything I believed about trust, family, and the weight of secrets that ordinary people carry without knowing it. My wife Martha had passed 2 years prior after a brave but losing battle with pancreatic cancer, and after months of my daughter Sarah insisting I couldn't keep rattling around that old farmhouse alone with nothing but memories and regret for company, I finally agreed to move into town where she could keep a closer eye on me. The realtor, an energetic woman in her 50s named Carol who seemed to know every family history in 3 counties, showed me this 1940s craftsman on Maple Street, with its wide front porch supported by thick columns, mature oak trees that had weathered decades of prairie storms, and a backyard that spoke of children's laughter and summer barbecues from generations past. Something about the house's solid bones and honest construction felt right to me, reminded me of the values my father had tried to instill during those hard years when we were scratching a living from stubborn Kansas soil and learning that integrity was more valuable than comfort. What sealed the deal wasn't the updated kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, or even the fenced backyard that would give me privacy for my morning coffee ritual, but the way my German Shepherd, Duke, immediately claimed the sunny spot by the living room window as his own. He walked through that house like he was surveying property he'd been waiting his whole life to occupy, his tail wagging with the kind of confidence that only comes from recognizing home when you find it. At my age, after 73 years of learning to read people, situations, and the subtle signs that separate truth from wishful thinking, I'd learned to trust Duke's instincts more than my own sometimes. Dogs see things we miss, sense undercurrents we're too civilized or too stubborn to acknowledge, and Duke had never been wrong about people or places in the 6 years since he'd wandered onto our property as a half-starved stray and somehow convinced Martha that he belonged with us. The previous owner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Henderson, who moved with the careful precision of someone whose bones had grown brittle with age and disappointment, had lived there for 40 years before her family convinced her to move to assisted living after a fall that left her with a broken hip and a fear of being alone that she couldn't shake. Her son Robert handled the sale, a nervous man in his 50s who wore expensive suits but had calloused hands that suggested he hadn't always worked behind a desk, and who seemed eager to close quickly, almost desperate to finalize the transaction and move on to whatever came next in his carefully compartmentalized life. When I mentioned the strange steel door in the basement behind the furnace during our final walkthrough, he barely glanced up from the paperwork he was organizing with obsessive precision, just shrugged his shoulders in a gesture that seemed calculated to discourage further questions, and said his mother had used it for storage, nothing important, just old Christmas decorations and boxes of tax records that weren't worth the trouble of moving. Duke had sniffed around that door during our initial walkthrough, his ears pricked forward in that particular way that meant he'd caught something interesting, something that demanded investigation. I figured it was just mouse droppings or the lingering scent of old paint cans and forgotten household chemicals, the kind of mysterious odors that accumulate in basements over decades of storage and neglect. But there was something in Duke's posture, a tension in his shoulders and a focus in his gaze, that suggested he was processing information I couldn't access, reading a story written in scents and traces that my human senses were too crude to interpret. The steel door itself was unremarkable at first glance, painted industrial gray and fitted with a lock that looked military surplus, the kind of heavy-duty hardware you'd use to secure something genuinely valuable or dangerous. It was positioned behind the furnace in a way that made it almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it, tucked into a corner where the basement's original stone foundation met a newer concrete wall that had obviously been added years after the house's construction. Growing up during the Depression in rural Kansas, back when the dust storms could blot out the sun for days and families learned to make do with whatever they could grow, fix, or trade for, my father taught me that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by how he treated what was entrusted to him. Our farm was small, barely 60 acres of stubborn soil that yielded corn and wheat only when the weather cooperated and the prices didn't collapse before harvest time. Every fence post was straight, every gate hung true, and every animal was fed before we sat down to our own meals, no matter how little we had for ourselves. My father's hands were permanently stained with motor oil from fixing neighbors' tractors for the cost of parts, spending his Sundays crawling under machinery that belonged to families who were struggling just as hard as we were but couldn't afford professional repairs. He never charged for labor, said that helping others wasn't charity, but just what decent people did when they had skills that could solve problems and ease burdens that might otherwise break good people's spirits. The first dog I truly bonded with was a mutt named Ranger, half border collie and half something tougher that gave him the intelligence to anticipate my needs, and the courage to face down situations that would have intimidated a purebred with softer instincts. Ranger followed me through morning and evening chores, learned to anticipate which tools I'd need before I reached for them, and somehow understood that his job was to be my partner in the endless work that kept our small operation running. He never left my side during the long, lonely hours in the fields, whether I was walking fence lines in the bitter cold of January or combining wheat in the crushing heat of July. When I was 12, Ranger disappeared for 3 days without explanation, just vanished one morning while I was doing chores, leaving me heartbroken and convinced that coyotes or wild dogs had claimed another friend. But on the fourth morning, he returned, leading me through the pasture to where our prize heifer had gotten tangled in barbed wire down by the creek, bleeding and exhausted but still alive, because Ranger had somehow found her and then found me in time to make a difference. That's when I understood that dogs see things we miss, know things we don't through senses and instincts that evolution has refined over thousands of years of partnership with humans who were smart enough to recognize that some kinds of intelligence don't require words or formal education. Their loyalty runs deeper than human understanding, rooted in pack dynamics and survival instincts that connect them to truths we've forgotten in our rush to civilize ourselves beyond recognition. My father died young, heart attack at 52, while he was fixing the Parkers' combine during harvest season, collapsing in their field with grease under his fingernails and satisfaction in his heart because he'd solved another mechanical puzzle that would keep a family fed through another winter. I inherited not just the farm and its debts, but his philosophy that every mystery has an explanation if you're patient enough to find it. Every problem has a solution if you're willing to work long enough and think hard enough. And every man has to decide whether he'll face hard truths or live comfortable lies, because avoiding reality doesn't make it disappear, just makes it more dangerous when it finally catches up with you. Martha and I met at a church social in 1972, one of those awkward community gatherings where the older women tried to matchmake between eligible young people who were too shy or too stubborn to find each other naturally. She was a teacher, 24 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, including my nervous habit of jingling the change in my pocket when I was trying to work up the courage to ask a pretty woman to dance. We married 6 months later in a simple ceremony that focused more on commitment than spectacle, and spent the next 48 years building something solid together, brick by brick, season by season, through good times and hard times, and the long stretches in between when love was less about passion and more about showing up consistently for the work of making a life together. She taught school for 30 years. I worked construction during the day and ran my small engine repair shop out of our garage in the evenings. And we raised 3 children who grew up understanding that integrity wasn't negotiable and family came first, not because we preached about it, but because we lived it every day in ways too small and consistent for dramatic storytelling, but too important for casual dismissal. Our first dog as a married couple was a golden retriever named Buddy, a gentle giant who lived 14 years and taught our kids responsibility through daily walks, feeding schedules, and the patient work of training an intelligent animal to be a good citizen in a household that ran on routines and mutual respect. Buddy was followed by Rex, a German Shepherd mix who had been abandoned by owners who moved away and left him tied to a tree until animal control found him half-starved and completely traumatized. Rex took 2 years to trust humans again, but Martha had a way with damaged creatures that bordered on mystical, could calm any animal with her voice and gentle hands and an infinite pat. Eins that I admired but could never quite match. After Rex came Belle, a border collie who was too smart for her own good and needed constant mental stimulation to keep her out of trouble. Then Duke, each one woven into the fabric of our family life in ways that made them more than pets and less than human, but something precious and irreplaceable in between. Duke showed up at our back door as a skinny stray 2 years before Martha's cancer diagnosis, matted and cautious, but somehow conveying that he was asking for consideration rather than demanding charity. Martha took one look at him and said he was meant to be ours, and she was right, as usual. Duke became her constant companion through the chemotherapy that weakened her body but never broke her spirit, somehow knowing to rest his head on her lap during the worst days when the nausea made it impossible for her to keep food down, to walk slowly when her strength failed and every step required conscious effort, to alert me when she needed help in the night but was too proud or too tired to call out. He seemed to understand that his job was to be present without being demanding, to offer comfort without expecting anything in return, to bridge the gap between what medicine could do and what love required. After her funeral, when the house felt too quiet and too large, and every familiar routine had been disrupted by the absence of the woman who had been its heart for nearly half a century, Duke never left my side, and I realized that Martha had somehow prepared him to take care of me when she couldn't anymore. The decades that followed passed with the reliable rhythm of seasons and small-town life, marked by grandchildren's birthdays, high school graduations, community festivals, and the quiet satisfaction of work, done honestly for fair pay by people who understood that reputation was built one job at a time and could be destroyed by a single moment of carelessness or dishonesty. My repair shop became a gathering place for men my age, guys who remembered when machines were built to last and problems were solved with logic, patience, and the right tools rather than computer diagnostics and planned obsolescence. We drink coffee from chipped mugs and solve the world's problems while our hands worked on engines that could be fixed rather than replaced, finding satisfaction in restoration that went beyond mere mechanical function to touch something deeper about the relationship between humans and the tools that extend their capabilities. Duke grew older alongside me, his muzzle graying, his joints stiffening on cold mornings, but his mind sharp and his devotion unwavering, adapting to my slower pace and changing needs with the graceful acceptance that comes naturally to creatures who live fully in the present moment. We had our routines, our morning walks through neighborhoods that had become familiar over years of daily passage, our afternoon naps in the workshop where the smell of oil and metal and old wood created an atmosphere of purposeful calm, our evening surveys of the small kingdom we'd built together through decades of consistent effort and mutual support. I thought I understood how life worked, believed that good people got rewarded eventually, that hard work and fair dealing would see you through whatever challenges arose, that the world was fundamentally comprehensible if you approached it with enough patience and honesty. The house on Maple Street felt like the perfect place to spend whatever years I had left, close enough to Sarah's family that I could babysit the great-grandchildren and pass on whatever wisdom I'd accumulated through 7 decades of learning from mistakes, far enough from the old farm that I wouldn't be haunted by memories of Martha in every room and every corner where her presence had shaped the rhythm of daily life. The basement was dry, the furnace was newer than the one I'd been nursing along for 20 years with spare parts and stubborn determination, and that strange steel door seemed like nothing more than an oddity left behind by the previous owner, sealed shut and covered with 40 years of basement dust that spoke of long neglect and forgotten purposes. The house inspector had noted it in his report, but dismissed it as probably containing old records or holiday decorations, nothing that would affect the structural integrity or safety of the property. Robert Henderson had signed a disclosure statement that listed no hazardous materials or unusual features, and the title search had revealed no liens or legal complications that might suggest hidden problems. Everything about the purchase was straightforward, routine, the kind of transaction that happens thousands of times every day when elderly people downsize and younger families move up to houses with more space and established landscapes. But Duke couldn't leave that door alone. Every morning when we went downstairs to check the furnace and make sure the sump P. Ump was working properly, he'd walk straight to it, sniffing along the edges with the systematic thoroughness of a creature following scent trails that told stories I couldn't read. Sometimes he'd whine softly, a sound that wasn't distress but something more like frustration, as if he were trying to communicate information that I was too dense to understand. Sometimes he'd just stand there with his head tilted at that particular angle that meant he was listening to something beyond the range of human hearing, processing information through senses that evolution had refined for purposes that predated human civilization by millions of years. At first, I figured it was mice or maybe something the previous owner had stored that still held an interesting scent, some combination of organic compounds that triggered Duke's hunting instincts without representing any real threat or mystery. But as weeks passed, Duke's fascination with the door intensified rather than fading, as I'd expected it would once he'd satisfied his initial curiosity about this new environment and its unfamiliar odors. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and pace to the basement door, standing at the top of the stairs with his ears forward and his body tense until I followed him down, my bare feet cold against the concrete floor and my mind still foggy with sleep, but alert enough to recognize that Duke's behavior was following patterns that meant something, even if I couldn't decode their significance. The steel door was painted industrial gray, a color that suggested military or government origins rather than civilian use, and fitted with a heavy-duty lock that looked like military surplus, the kind of hardware you'd expect to find securing ammunition bunkers or classified document storage rather than basement storage in a residential neighborhood. No matter how carefully I examined it, running my fingers along the frame and testing the lock mechanism, I couldn't find any obvious way to open it without cutting through the metal or somehow bypassing the lock system, which appeared to be sophisticated enough to resist casual tampering. The door itself was clearly custom-made, fitted precisely into an opening that had been created specifically for its installation, suggesting a level of planning and expense that went far beyond typical home improvement projects. Mrs. Henderson's son had left his business card after the closing, a professional-looking piece of cardstock that listed him as a consultant for government contractors, and I called him one evening and asked about the door casually, mentioned that my dog seemed curious about what might be stored behind it, and wondered if he had a key or knew how to open it. There was a long pause before he answered, longer than seemed natural for such a simple question, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a carefully controlled quality that suggested he was choosing his words with unusual care. He said his mother had never talked about it, that she'd told him it was just old Christmas decorations and tax records, nothing important, and that he'd never bothered to open it because he'd assumed it contained the kind of accumulated household debris that every family collects over decades of living in the same place. Something in his voice didn't ring true, a subtle tension that suggested he knew more than he was willing to share, but I let it go because I didn't want to seem like I was prying into family business that didn't concern me. After all, every old house has its mysteries, architectural oddities, and previous owners' quirks that don't need solving, and not all of them represent problems that require investigation or resolution. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday evening in July, when the air conditioning was struggling against the heat and humidity that made even simple movement feel like work, and Duke's behavior shifted from curious to urgent in a way that demanded attention. We were watching the evening news, a routine that had become one of our few reliable anchors in the disrupted rhythm of life in a new place, when he suddenly stood up with every muscle tense and walked to the basement door with a purposefulness I'd never seen before. His whine was different this time, more insistent, carrying an undertone of anxiety that made my own heart rate increase in sympathetic response to whatever he was sensing. When I followed him downstairs, he went straight to the steel door and began pawing at the floor beside it, his claws scraping against concrete in a rhythm that seemed almost desperate, as if he were trying to dig through solid stone to reach something underneath. That's when I noticed something I'd missed during my previous examinations, a slight gap where the concrete floor didn't quite meet the door frame, as if the floor had settled over the years or been patched around something that was installed after the original foundation was poured. The gap was narrow, maybe half an inch at its widest point, but it ran along the entire bottom edge of the door and suggested that whatever lay beyond wasn't just a simple storage closet, but a space that had been excavated and fitted with its own flooring system. Duke's nose was pressed to that gap, his tail rigid with concentration, and every instinct I'd developed over 7 decades of reading situations and solving problems told me he'd found something genuinely significant, something that demanded investigation rather than casual dismissal. I knelt down beside him, ignoring the protest from joints that weren't as flexible as they'd been 20 years earlier, and ran my fingers along the edge where floor met door frame. That's when I felt it, a slight draft of air that carried a smell I couldn't quite identify, musty and metallic but with an undertone of something else, something that made my stomach tighten with unease even though I couldn't explain why. The air movement suggested that whatever space lay beyond the door was larger than a simple closet and was somehow connected to the house's ventilation system, which meant it had been designed for long-term use rather than simple storage. The smell wasn't decay or mold, but something more complex, a combination of preservatives and old paper and metals that had been stored in controlled conditions for extended periods. That night I lay awake thinking about Mrs. Henderson, trying to remember details from our brief conversations during the house sale and the closing process. She'd been polite but distant, answering questions about utilities and neighborhood routines with the kind of practiced responses that suggested she'd been through this conversation many times before, but always deflecting when topics touched on the house's history or her family's long residence there. Her son Robert had done most of the talking, handling paperwork and negotiations with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex transactions, but there had been something almost defensive in his manner when questions strayed beyond the purely procedural aspects of the sale. Now, with Duke's restless energy and that strange smell seeping through the gap under the steel door, I began to wonder what secrets that door was meant to keep, and why a family would go to such elaborate lengths to secure a basement storage area. Sleep became elusive as my mind churned through possibilities, each more troubling than the last, a mental exercise that felt like trying to solve a puzzle with most of the pieces missing and no clear picture of what the completed image should look like. During my construction years, I'd seen enough basements and hidden spaces to know that people sometimes built elaborate storage areas for valuables, important documents, or things they wanted to keep away from prying eyes. But the military-grade lock in Duke's increasingly agitated behavior suggested something more serious than family heirlooms or financial records. The door's construction and positioning indicated professional installation, the kind of work that required permits, inspections, and the involvement of contractors who specialized in secure storage systems, which meant there should be records somewhere of when and why it was built. But my searches through county building permits and city planning records revealed nothing about modifications to the Henderson property, which suggested that whatever work had been done was either performed without official approval or had been classified in some way that kept it out of public records. I found myself studying Mrs. Henderson's son's business card more carefully, noting that his listed occupation as a consultant for government contractors could cover a wide range of activities, some of which might explain why a residential basement would need the kind of security measures typically associated with military or intelligence facilities. The realtor had mentioned during our initial conversations that Mrs. Henderson's late husband had been some kind of government worker, retired from a job he never talked about, and I began to piece together a picture of a family that kept secrets as a matter of professional necessity rather than personal preference. Duke's routine changed completely during this period, his normal patterns of eating, sleeping, and exercise disrupted by whatever he was sensing from behind that steel door. Instead of his usual afternoon nap in the sunny living room where he could monitor the street and keep track of neighborhood activities, he'd position himself at the basement door, alert and watchful, as if guarding against something or waiting for permission to act on instincts that were pulling him toward investigation rather than patience. His behavior was so unlike his normal calm demeanor that I started to question my own judgment, wondering if I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, reading too much into an old man's paranoia and a dog's natural curiosity abo. An unfamiliar sense in a new environment. But the more I observed Duke's consistent focus on that door, the more convinced I became that he was responding to something real, something that demanded attention rather than dismissal. Dogs don't maintain that level of concentrated interest in imaginary threats or meaningless anomalies. Their survival instincts are too finely tuned to waste energy on false alarms. Whatever was behind that steel door was producing signals that Duke's senses could detect, and his intelligence was interpreting as significant, even if I lacked the sensory equipment to confirm his assessment independently. The gap under the door continued to emit that subtle draft carrying its complex mixture of odors, and I began to notice that the airflow varied with changes in outside weather conditions, suggesting that the space beyond was connected to some kind of ventilation system that allowed air exchange with the outside environment. My conversations with family and neighbors took on a subtle investigative tone as I tried to learn more about the Henderson family without appearing overly interested or arousing suspicions about my motives for asking questions that might seem intrusive to people who valued privacy and minded their own business. Sarah noticed the change in my demeanor during our weekly dinners, the way my attention seemed divided between present conversation and some internal preoccupation that I wasn't ready to share, and she asked pointed questions about how I was adjusting to the new house, whether I was having any problems or regrets about the move that she could help me address. I deflected her concerns, not wanting to worry her over what might be nothing more than an overactive imagination, combined with the normal stress of adapting to a new environment at an age when change becomes increasingly difficult to process and accept. But Duke's presence at these family dinners became a source of comment from the grandchildren, who had always enjoyed his calm, friendly demeanor and his willingness to serve as a living pillow during movie nights and holiday celebrations. He'd always been social with visitors, greeting them with enthusiasm before settling into whatever spot offered the best combination of comfort and surveillance over family activities. But now he seemed distracted, preoccupied, returning to his post by the basement door as soon as politeness allowed. The children noticed that he wasn't interested in games or treats, that his attention was focused elsewhere in a way that made him seem almost absent even when he was physically present in the room with us. The mailman, a chatty guy named Pete who'd been delivering to the neighborhood for 15 years, and seemed to know every family's history, habits, and recent developments, mentioned during one of our casual conversations that Mrs. Henderson had always been pleasant but private, someone who acknowledged his daily presence with polite waves but never lingered for the kind of small talk that many elderly residents seem to crave as a way of maintaining connection with the broader community. Pete remembered that her husband had rarely spoken to anyone and seemed uncomfortable when neighbors tried to be friendly, the kind of man who hurried from car to house without making eye contact or acknowledging attempts at casual conversation. According to Pete, Mr. Henderson had worked from home during his final years, receiving regular deliveries of packages that required signature confirmation and sometimes official mail that came in envelopes marked with government seals and handling instructions. More significantly, Pete recalled that after Mr. Henderson died 5 years ago, there had been several official-looking visitors to the house, men in suits who arrived in government vehicles, stayed for brief periods, and never returned after completing whatever business had brought them there. These visits had occurred over a period of several months, always during weekday business hours when most neighbors would be at work, and had stopped abruptly without explanation or obvious resolution. Mrs. Henderson had seemed nervous during this period, according to Pete, less willing to acknowledge his daily presence and more likely to retreat quickly into her house when she saw unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood or noticed people who seemed to be observing her property more closely than casual interest would explain. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't like, a pattern that suggested the Henderson family had been involved in activities that attracted government attention and required ongoing security measures even after official retirement. But I still lacked any concrete evidence that something was actually wrong, any proof that my growing suspicions were based on reality rather than the kind of paranoid thinking that can develop when elderly people have too much time to worry about problems that may not actually exist. That changed on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in late July, when Duke's persistence finally pushed me past the point of passive curiosity into active investigation, a decision that would alter the course of both our lives in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The breakthrough came when I decided to examine the basement more systematically, armed with a powerful flashlight, a digital camera to document whatever I found, and the kind of methodical approach I'd learned from decades of troubleshooting mechanical problems where success depended on careful observation and logical analysis rather than guesswork or wishful thinking. Duke led me straight to the steel door, but this time I noticed something different about the gap where the concrete floor met the door frame. The space was wider than I'd remembered, as if recent changes in temperature and humidity had caused the materials to expand or contract in ways that increased the separation between different components of the installation. When I shined the flashlight into the gap and adjusted the angle to maximize the amount of light that could penetrate the narrow opening, I could see that the space beyond the door extended much further back than seemed possible for a simple storage room, suggesting that whoever had built this facility had excavated a significant area under the house's foundation and fitted it with its own structural supports and environmental controls. More importantly, there were electrical wires running along the edge of that gap, modern wiring that didn't match the house's original electrical system and appeared to carry significantly more power than would be needed for simple lighting or ventilation in a storage area. Someone had retrofitted this space with power, climate control, communication capabilities, and God knows what else, long after the house was built, and probably without the knowledge of neighbors or local authorities who might have asked uncomfortable questions about the purpose of such elaborate construction. Duke's nose was pressed to the gap again, but now I could smell what had captured his attention from the beginning, a distinctive odor that took me back to my construction days when I'd worked on government contracts that required special handling of sensitive materials. It was the smell of preservative chemicals used to protect documents and photographs from humidity, decay, and the kind of environmental damage that could destroy irreplaceable records over time. That's when the implications hit me like a physical blow, a moment of understanding that made my hands shake and my heart rate spike as I realized that this wasn't storage in any conventional sense, but a vault professionally designed and equipped to preserve whatever secrets the Henderson family had been keeping for decades. My construction experience told me that this kind of installation would have cost tens of thousands of dollars and required the involvement of contractors who specialized in secure facilities, which meant that whatever was being protected was valuable enough to justify that level of expense and risk. The electrical system alone would have required permits and inspections unless the work had been done by people with the authority to bypass normal regulatory oversight, which suggested connections to government agencies or defense contractors with the resources and clearance to operate outside conventional legal frameworks. Duke's behavior took on new significance as I realized that his instincts had been correct from the beginning. that his persistent focus on this door represented not mere curiosity, but a recognition that something important was hidden here, something that demanded investigation and possibly action. Dogs have served alongside humans in military and law enforcement roles for thousands of years, their senses and instincts refined by evolution and training to detect threats, locate hidden objects, and alert their human partners to situations that require attention. Duke had been trying to tell me something from our first day in this house, and I'd been too stubborn or too civilized to trust his assessment of the situation. That's when Duke did something that changed everything, an action so deliberate and purposeful that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or random behavior. He walked away from the steel door, looked back at me to ensure I was paying attention, then moved to the furnace area and began pawing at a specific section of the concrete floor where a loose board had been placed over what I'd assumed was a repair patch or utility access point. The board shifted slightly under his weight, revealing that it wasn't permanently installed but had been positioned to conceal something underneath, something that had been deliberately hidden but remained accessible to anyone who knew where to look and understood its significance. Under that board, wrapped in old cloth and sealed in a heavy-duty plastic bag tee. Had protected it from moisture and decay, I found a key. Not just any key, but a precision-manufactured piece of hardware that matched the sophisticated lock mechanism on the steel door, a key that had obviously been hidden by someone who wanted to ensure access while maintaining security against casual discovery. Alongside the key was a handwritten note in careful cursive writing, dated just 2 months before Mrs. Henderson moved to assisted living, and addressed to whoever might eventually find it. The note was written on expensive stationery, the kind used for important correspondence, and its contents made my blood run cold as I realized the magnitude of what Duke's instincts had led me to discover. The note explained that Mrs. Henderson's husband hadn't been just any government worker, but a CIA operative who had specialized in document recovery and intelligence preservation during a 30-year career that had taken him to some of the world's most dangerous locations, and involved him in operations that would never be acknowledged in official histories or public records. The basement vault contained classified materials that he'd removed from various operations over the course of his career, documents and evidence that he'd collected not for personal gain, but as insurance against betrayal by his own agency and protection against enemies who might seek revenge for operations that had disrupted their activities or eliminated their allies. Mrs. Henderson's note revealed that her husband had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia in his final years, a condition that had made him increasingly paranoid about the security of the materials he'd accumulated and fearful that his declining mental capacity would make him vulnerable to manipulation by people who wanted access to information that could be used to blackmail government officials, expose ongoing operations, or settle old scores with intelligence assets who were no longer protected by active service status. Rather than return the materials to the agency as required by his security clearance, he'd hidden them in this elaborately constructed vault and sworn his wife to secrecy about their existence, believing that their contents would implicate innocent people or expose operations that should remain buried for the protection of assets who were still active in the field. Mrs. Henderson had known about the vault's existence but not its specific contents, had lived in constant terror that someone would come looking for the materials, and had moved to assisted living partly to escape the burden of guarding secrets she didn't understand and couldn't safely dispose of on her own. The note ended with a plea for discretion, a hope that whoever found the vault would handle its contents with wisdom and conscience rather than seeking personal gain or publicity, and a warning that the materials inside could destroy innocent lives, compromise ongoing operations, and expose intelligence assets to retaliation if they fell into the wrong hands or were released without careful consideration of their implications. Duke sat beside me as I read the note, his calm presence the only thing keeping me grounded as the magnitude of this discovery sank in, and I began to understand that my quiet retirement had just become infinitely more complicated. The decision about whether to open that vault couldn't be made lightly or quickly, but I knew that Duke's persistence had led me to this moment for a reason, that walking away wasn't an option now that I understood what was at stake and what responsibilities had been placed on my shoulders by circumstances beyond my control. The key felt heavy in my hand, not because of its physical weight but because of what it represented, the power to unlock secrets that had shaped international relations, influenced government policies, and affected the lives of people whose names I would probably never know, but whose safety might depend on how I handled this information. Opening that steel door felt like crossing a threshold into a world I'd never wanted to enter, a place where ordinary moral calculations didn't apply, and every choice carried consequences I couldn't fully anticipate or control. The lock mechanism was sophisticated but well maintained, turning smoothly despite years of disuse, and the door itself swung open on hinges that had been regularly lubricated to prevent the kind of noise that might attract unwanted attention. The vault beyond was larger than I'd expected, professionally constructed with climate control systems, fireproof filing cabinets, and shelving systems that spoke of serious money and long-term planning by people who understood the value of the materials they were protecting. Duke stayed close as I surveyed the contents, his steady breathing and calm demeanor a reminder that whatever chaos this represented, some things remained constant and trustworthy in a world that had suddenly become much more complex. Indeed dangerous than I'd imagined. The files were organized by year in operation, hundreds of documents spanning 3 decades of covert activities, and even a casual glance revealed information that could embarrass foreign governments, expose intelligence assets, and destroy the careers, and possibly the lives of people who might still be alive and active in government service or private sector positions that required security clearances. There were photographs that documented meetings between government officials and individuals whose identities were obviously meant to remain secret, financial records that traced money flows through accounts in countries that didn't cooperate with American law enforcement, communication intercepts that revealed the content of conversations between foreign leaders and their advisors, and what appeared to be insurance policies. Documents that Mr. Henderson had apparently collected as protection against betrayal or abandonment by his own agency. Mixed in with the classified materials were personal items that provided context for the professional documents, letters from field operations that revealed the human cost of intelligence work, commendations that had never been publicly acknowledged, and evidence of moral compromises that had clearly haunted the collector in his final years. This wasn't just stolen intelligence, it was the accumulated weight of a man's career in shadows, preserved as both treasure and burden for whoever came after him. Some files contained evidence of operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted weapons smuggling networks, and protected American interests in regions where conventional diplomacy had failed, but others documented activities that seemed to violate international law, compromise innocent civilians, and serve political interests that had little to do with national security. The collection represented decades of moral ambiguity, professional achievement, and personal sacrifice by someone who had served his country faithfully, but had ultimately decided that some secrets were too dangerous to entrust to institutions that might not use them wisely. The decision about what to do with this discovery couldn't be made quickly or alone, but I knew that Duke's persistence had led me to it for a reason that transcended simple curiosity or coincidence. His behavior over the past months made perfect sense now. He'd been responding to chemical traces and electronic emanations from sophisticated preservation systems, following instincts that had identified this vault as something significant that demanded investigation by the human member of our partnership. The materials in this vault represented not just information but responsibility, the burden of deciding how knowledge should be used when its misuse could cause genuine harm to innocent people whose only crime was serving their country in roles that required secrecy and sacrifice. I spent the next 2 weeks researching current intelligence protocols, studying whistleblower protection laws, and consulting with a lawyer who specialized in federal regulations governing classified materials and their handling by civilians who found themselves in possession of information they weren't authorized to have. The lawyer, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patricia Chen, who had handled similar cases involving government contractors and former intelligence personnel, was clear about the legal complexities involved, the potential criminal charges for possession of classified materials, and the need for careful documentation of how and when I discovered the vault and its contents. But she also understood that some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too important to destroy without proper consideration of their implications for national security and individual safety. Working with her guidance, I developed a plan that would protect both the national interest and the innocent people whose names appeared in these files, a strategy that acknowledged the legitimacy of government claims to classified materials while also recognizing the ethical concerns that had apparently motivated Mr. Henderson's decision to preserve evidence of operations that might otherwise have been lost or deliberately destroyed to protect institutional interests. We photographed everything systematically, creating multiple copies of the most significant documents using techniques that would preserve their evidentiary value while protecting the originals from handling damage. We established a secure chain of custody that would allow authorized officials to recover the materials while protecting me from charges of theft, espionage, or obstruction of justice. Most importantly, we developed a communication strategy that would allow government agencies to assess the contents of the vault while ensuring that any decision about their ultimate disposition would be made by people with appropriate clearance and responsibility rather than by a retired mechanic who had stumbled into a situation far beyond his expertise or authority. Duke remained my constant companion through this process, his presence a reminder that loyalty and courage sometimes require us to act on incomplete information and trust our instincts about right and wrong when official guidance isn't available or applicable to our specific situation. His initial detection of the vault had required senses and instincts that I lacked, but the decisions about how to handle its contents required human judgment, moral reasoning, and an understanding of consequences that went beyond immediate self-interest to consider the broader implications of actions that could affect national security, international relations, and the lives of people whose service to their country had earned them protection rather than exposure. The handover took place on a crisp October morning that reminded me of Kansas autumns, when the air was clear and sharp and every detail seemed etched with unusual clarity. The meeting wasn't held in some dramatic location from spy novels, but in the conference room of a federal building downtown, with representatives from multiple agencies, lawyers for all parties, and enough paperwork to document every decision and transfer in ways that would satisfy both legal requirements and institutional protocols for handling sensitive materials. I'd expected suspicion, hostility, or at least bureaucratic indifference, but the federal officials seemed more relieved than angry, grateful to recover materials that had been missing from their inventories for years, and concerned about the security implications of classified documents existing outside official custody for extended periods. The CIA representative, a quietly professional woman who introduced herself only as Ms. Rodriguez, explained that Mr. Henderson's unauthorized retention of classified documents had been suspected but never proven, that his death had closed their investigation without resolution, and that my discovery of the vault had actually solved a long-standing security problem while allowing them to assess potential damage to ongoing operations and relationships with foreign intelligence services. There were no charges filed against me, no penalties for my possession of materials I'd found accidentally, just a substantial monetary reward for returning classified documents to proper custody and a formal letter of appreciation for my discretion and cooperation throughout the process. More importantly, the officials assured me that the materials would be reviewed carefully, with attention to the ethical concerns that had apparently motivated Mr. Henderson's actions and the protection of individuals whose safety might be compromised by inappropriate disclosure of their identities or activities. Some operations would be reassessed in light of evidence that hadn't been available to previous reviewers. Some people would be protected from exposure that could endanger their lives or careers, and some mistakes would be acknowledged and corrected through channels that existed specifically to address moral concerns about intelligence activities that had been conducted without sufficient oversight or consideration of their long-term consequences. It wasn't perfect justice, but it represented a recognition that secrets sometimes serve evil as much as good, that institutions can make mistakes that require correction, and that ordinary citizens sometimes have to make extraordinary moral choices when they're confronted with information that challenges their assumptions about how their government operates and what sacrifices are made in the name of national security. The officials were particularly interested in the preservation systems that had kept the documents in excellent condition despite decades of storage, and they asked detailed questions about the vault's construction that suggested they were learning from Mr. Henderson's methods for protecting sensitive materials against environmental damage and unauthorized access. The aftermath brought unexpected peace and a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between individual conscience and institutional loyalty that had been tested in ways I'd never expected to face at my age. Duke seemed to sense that our mission was complete. His obsession with the basement door vanished overnight, replaced by his normal routine of naps in sunny spots, leisurely walks through the neighborhood, and quiet companionship that asked for nothing more than the simple pleasure of being together. The basement felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the removal of those accumulated secrets had lifted a weight that had pressed down on the house for decades without anyone fully understanding its source or significance. The house on Maple Street became truly ours in ways that went beyond legal ownership to encompass a sense of belonging that comes from having faced challenges Tojith. R and emerged stronger for the experience. Sarah noticed the change in my demeanor immediately, the return of the calm confidence she remembered from her childhood, when problems were things to be solved rather than endured, and the future seemed manageable through careful planning and consistent effort. When I finally told her the whole story, leaving out details that weren't mine to share, but giving her enough information to understand why my behavior had been unusual for several months, she understood why I needed to handle the situation alone first, why some discoveries require solitary processing before they can be shared with people whose safety and peace of mind might be affected by knowledge they hadn't asked for and couldn't use constructively. The reward money was substantial enough to make a real difference in our family's financial security, and it went into college funds for the great-grandchildren, an investment in education that would pay dividends long after the circumstances that generated it had been forgotten by everyone except the few people who needed to remember. The legal fees were modest, thanks to Patricia Chen's efficiency and the government's genuine appreciation for my cooperation, and the story became family legend, proof that integrity and courage can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, and that doing the right thing doesn't always require dramatic gestures or heroic sacrifices. Sometimes just careful thought and willingness to trust your instincts when official guidance isn't available. Mrs. Henderson's son Robert called to thank me personally after the federal officials contacted him as part of their process of closing the case and ensuring that all family members understood the resolution. He admitted that his family had lived with the fear of discovery for years, never knowing exactly what his father had hidden or when it might surface to destroy their reputation, compromise their security clearances, or expose them to retaliation from people who had been affected by operations they knew nothing about. He'd rushed the house sale partly to escape that burden, hoping that new ownership would somehow insulate his family from consequences they couldn't predict or control, and my discovery had freed them from decades of anxiety and guilt about secrets they'd inherited without understanding. The government officials had been professional and discreet throughout the entire process. Neighbors never learned why federal cars had briefly appeared in their quiet neighborhood, and the story remained contained within the small circle of people who needed to know the truth for legal or security reasons. The vault itself was dismantled and removed by specialized contractors who left no trace of its existence except for a small room that now serves as my workshop, where I repair small engines and restore antique tools while Duke supervises from his favorite corner, content to watch me work with the patient attention that only comes from creatures who understand that some activities are valuable for their own sake rather than their practical outcomes. The winter that followed was one of the most peaceful I'd experienced since Martha's death, marked by routines that felt sustainable and relationships that provided genuine satisfaction rather than mere distraction from loss and loneliness. Duke and I developed new patterns that honored our partnership while accommodating the changes that age brings to both humans and dogs, adjustments in pace and expectations that reflected acceptance rather than resignation. We still took our morning walks, but they became more about observation than exercise, opportunities to notice seasonal changes, greet neighbors, and maintain connection with a community that had become home in ways that had nothing to do with the dramatic events that had tested our character and revealed strengths we hadn't known we possessed. The great-grandchildren were fascinated by Duke's role in the discovery, though the story they heard was carefully edited to emphasize his intelligence and loyalty rather than the specific nature of what he'd found. They learned that dogs can detect things humans miss, that patience and persistence often reveal truths that hurried examination overlooks, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from seeking adventure, but from paying attention to the subtle signs that something in our familiar environment has changed in ways that demand investigation. Duke became something of a hero in their minds, proof that animals are partners rather than mere pets, creatures whose instincts and intelligence can complement human capabilities in ways that make both species more effective than either could be alone. Spring brought confirmation that we'd made the right decisions about the vault and its contents. Patricia Chen contacted me to report that the government's review of the materials had led to several positive developments, including the protection of intelligence assets who had been at risk of exposure, the correction of historical records that had contained errors or omissions that affected veterans' benefits and recognition, and the implementation of new protocols for handling classified materials that would prevent future accumulation of unauthorized collections like the one Mr. Henderson had assembled. Some operations had been reassessed and their participants given recognition that had been withheld for security reasons that were no longer relevant, and some families had finally learned the truth about relatives whose service had been classified for decades after their deaths. The knowledge that our actions had produced concrete benefits for real people gave weight and meaning to the entire experience, transforming what might have been merely an interesting story into something that had genuine value beyond our immediate family circle. Duke seemed to understand that his contribution had been significant, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that suggested awareness of his role in events that had extended far beyond our neighborhood and affected people whose lives had been shaped by secrets they couldn't share or burdens they couldn't explain to families who deserved better understanding of the sacrifices made in their name. The summer brought visitors who came not for dramatic revelations, but for the simple pleasure of spending time with family members who had proven their ability to handle unexpected challenges with wisdom and discretion. The great-grandchildren spent long afternoons in the workshop, learning to use tools safely and understanding that mechanical problems usually have logical solutions if you approach them with patience and systematic thinking. Duke participated in these lessons not as a distraction, but as a reminder that observation and instinct are valuable supplements to technical knowledge, that some problems require senses and perspectives that formal education doesn't provide, and that partnerships between species can accomplish things that individual effort cannot achieve. As autumn arrived with its familiar rhythm of harvest colors and shorter days, I found myself reflecting on the year's events with a sense of completion rather than mere survival. The house on Maple Street had tested us in ways we couldn't have anticipated, but we'd met those challenges together and emerged stronger for the experience. Duke's behavior had returned completely to normal, his attention focused on present activities rather than mysterious signals from hidden spaces, his contentment evident in the way he settled into sunny spots and watched the world with the patient interest of a creature whose work is done and whose loyalty has been properly valued. The basement workshop became a gathering place for neighbors who needed small repairs or wanted company while working on projects that required more space than their own homes provided. Duke greeted these visitors with the same calm friendliness he'd always shown, but I noticed that people seemed more relaxed around him now, as if his reputation as a creature with exceptional instincts had enhanced rather than intimidated their appreciation for his presence. Children were particularly drawn to him, perhaps sensing that he was a dog with stories to tell, a companion who had participated in events that mattered beyond the usual routines of suburban life. Looking back now after months of processing and integrating the lessons of that extraordinary period, I understand that Duke's instincts had been correct from the very beginning, that his persistence had forced me to confront a situation that required exactly the kind of moral courage my father had tried to teach me during those long-ago days on the Kansas farm, when the difference between right and wrong seemed simpler, but the stakes were just as real. The steel door in the basement had held more than classified documents. It had contained a test of character, a challenge to decide whether personal safety was more important than doing what was right, regardless of the complications or risks involved in acting on principles rather than convenience. Duke had been my guide through that challenge, his unwavering loyalty and trust giving me the confidence to act when action was required, rather than retreat into the comfortable assumption that someone else would handle problems that seemed too large or too complex for ordinary citizens to address effectively. His presence had provided stability during moments when the full implications of our discovery threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly about consequences and responsibilities that extended far beyond our immediate family circle. The house is quiet now in the way that speaks of peace rather than emptiness, filled with the ordinary sounds of daily life lived by people who have faced extraordinary circumstances and found themselves equal to the challenge. The basement holds nothing more dangerous than Christmas decorations and tax records, workshop tools and hobby supplies, the accumulated possessions of a family that values function over display and substance over appearance. My morning walks with Duke follow predictable routes through neighborhoods that feel like home in ways that have nothing to do with dramatic discoveries or government recognition. Everything to do with the simple satisfaction of belonging to a community where neighbors know each other's names and children grow up understanding that adults can be trusted to protect them from dangers they don't need to understand in detail. We've learned together that mysteries don't always need solving, but when they do, the solutions usually require more courage than cleverness, more persistence than inspiration, more willingness to trust relationships that have proven their worth over time than confidence in our ability to handle challenges that exceed our experience or expertise. The steel door is gone now, removed by federal contractors and replaced with ordinary drywall that matches the rest of the basement walls, but its lessons remain, woven into the daily fabric of a life made richer by unexpected tests and unexpected victories. The reward money continues to grow in accounts established for the great-grandchildren's education, a legacy that will provide opportunities they might not otherwise have had, funded by actions that demonstrated values more important than any curriculum could teach. Duke's role in the discovery has become part of family history, a reminder that intelligence takes many forms and that partnership between different species can accomplish things that individual effort cannot achieve, no matter how determined or well-intentioned that effort might be. Winter evenings find us settled in the living room, Duke in his favorite spot by the window where he can monitor neighborhood activities without missing any conversation, me in the chair that has become perfectly adjusted to my preferences for reading light and back support. The contentment we share comes not from the drama of past events, but from the security of knowing that we faced challenges together and made decisions we can live with, choices that honored both practical necessities and moral obligations without compromising either for the sake of convenience or personal advantage. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing required more courage than you thought you possessed, where the discovery of hidden truths forced you to make decisions that could affect people you'd never meet? Have you had a faithful companion, human or animal, whose instincts guided you through challenges your rational mind couldn't navigate alone, whose loyalty gave you strength to act when action seemed impossible but inaction seemed wrong? I'd love to hear about the moments when ordinary life revealed extraordinary choices, when partnership and persistence uncovered secrets that needed to be brought into the light, or when trust in relationships that had proven their worth over time gave you the confidence to face responsibilities you'd never expected to shoulder. Tell me about the times when your quiet neighborhood became the setting for decisions that mattered more than you could have imagined, when doing the right thing turned out to be more complicated, but also more rewarding than you'd ever dreamed possible.